wondering what RBI's SLR cut really means for the economy, while some of you must be fuming at the power grid's failure. To discuss just these very issues, I have with me in the studio Sukumar Ranganathan. Thanks, Sukumar, for being on this show today. So let's talk about RBI first. It's cut the SLR, which is the statutory liquidity ratio, and is also projected an increase in the inflation. Now, giving an overall picture, what do you think this means for the economy?
The RBI has basically done an holding job, right? It's ensured that inflation stays under control because it believes, and I think it's justified in believing this, that there will be inflationary tendencies in the economy as a whole. So one way to keep inflation under check is to keep interest rates high, and the RBI has kept them reasonably high. There were lots of demands for RBI to cut the interest rate because, as you know, growth is slowing, and that's not an issue that RBI can address. But what it has done is that it's ensured that banks have a little more money to play around with, to lend, which is why they've gone in for the slight adjustment that they've done in the liquidity ratio. But other than that, there's very little that RBI can do in this scenario. If you read the policy statement, I think to me the material aspects of the policy statement are the one that don't have anything to do with either the interest rate or the cash reserve ratio or the liquidity ratio. If you look at the other statements of RBI about the assumptions that were made and what it believes is going to happen, RBI believes that inflation is still a concern. RBI believes that the economy is slowing down, and RBI also believes that the answer to many of these questions will have to come from the central government. These will have to be fiscal answers. They cannot be monetary answers.
Now, a lot of people are speculating, saying that if the RBI had done the interest rate cut, it would have fueled liquidity, which is the need of the economy. Do you think so?
I don't think so. Right. I think there are several reasons why growth isn't happening, and I do not really think the unavailability of credit is a reason for that. Although, to be sure, lenders are a little reluctant to lend, but this has largely to do with policy issues. You look at the Indian banking sector, and you look at the magnitude of stressed assets they have on account of power projects that haven't taken off. Now, power projects in India don't take off for one of two reasons. One, land. Two, fuel linkages. They are unable to get the fuel required. Can the RBI change any of this? Not really. Only policy can change it. You look at the telecommunications sector, most people are unwilling to lend to the telecommunications sector, and understandably so, because there's a huge policy overhang there and a legal overhang, and we still do not have any clarity on what's going to happen. So these are not issues that the Reserve Bank can address. And I'm not even getting into the area of the fiscal deficit and what the government can do, but I think it's a little unfair to expect RBI to spur growth by let's say infusing more liquidity into the system. And I think it's extremely short-sighted to believe that a flush of liquidity in the system will lead to growth. I think it will lead to growth if the policy environment is conducive. If the policy environment is not conducive, it's not going to lead to growth.
And do you see the policy environment being conducive any time in the near future?
I think what we will see over the next 6 months are a lot of efforts by the central government to try and change things. So if you look at the concessions that they've made in the Land Acquisition Act, which comes up next week when Parliament opens, hopefully it will come up sometime in this session. Or if you look at the kind of committees that have been set up on the tax front, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to give investors confidence that we're not going to return to what was called the raid raj, where income tax departments could pretty much raid anyone, and it was simply a hassle doing business. I think what they're also trying to do is to remove some roadblocks in the way of business. Land was a big roadblock. Everyone has issues with land. Acquiring it is a big problem in India. But the extent to which they'll be able to do all this is still questionable, because there are a lot of political questions that are hanging around that loom large over their ability to actually get meaningful reforms done. But that said, next 6 months, they will try to do a lot.
Now let's talk about something that's been dominating the news nationally and internationally, the power grid failure. Now we know that the northern grid failed early this week, and then the northeastern and the eastern grid as well failed. Now, how do you view this entire picture, and what do you think was the reason for this mass failure?
See, there are two ways to view this. One is the very micro view of saying state X overdrew, and as a result everyone had to suffer, and also to say why did the government not act, and all those things, which is fine. I think these are questions that need to be answered. But I think the macro issue, which everyone sort of not really looked at, is that between 2002 and 2010, or between 2000 and 2010, 10 years, the Indian economy quadrupled in size from around $460 billion to 1.7 trillion. If you look at installed power generation capacity in India, and this is total, it includes thermal, it includes hydro, it includes everything, it grew in the same period from around 100,000 megawatts to 160,000 megawatts. So obviously you're not adding enough capacity, right? When you have an economy that's growing at such a significant rate, and the world over, there are enough studies to show the correlation between economic growth and the need for power. So clearly we haven't managed to put down that installed capacity. Why have we not managed to do so? Because again we come back to the issue of the policy environment, which is not conducive for power plants. We've not really gone ahead and done the kind of power sector reforms that we should have done, and at some point in time all these are going to come back to bite.
Given that such a situation does arise, what sort of contingency plans you think we should have in place to be able to deal with such a situation?
See, I don't think you can have contingency plans when overall you have a shortage, right? What you can have is, it's a bit like using a band-aid when a complex surgical procedure is required. So it may stem the flow of blood, but for a few seconds, I know for a fact that it's highly unlikely that we'll have another grid failure in the next, let's say, month or so. I hope we don't. But you look at the scenario across the country. Haryana is extremely power deficient. Gurgaon, which is part of Haryana, if you go to any of the condominiums there, the people there live on 14 hours of diesel power, right? Generators generate power and they use it. So it's not coming from the grid, it's not coming from the network. You go down south, you look at Karnataka, you have 12-hour and 16-hour power cuts. So people don't have power, right? So, and that's not going to change. Now when people don't have power, and the grid keeps functioning, and then you say, oh, people overdrew, so the grid broke down. I don't think it's the time to speak about contingency measures. I think what we really need to do is to work out a way to add power. We need to do it at a war footing. And I don't know whether we are even thinking along those lines, because the feeling I get from looking at most people in the power ministry and most people in the Prime Minister's office after this crisis is that everyone seems happy. It's over. We've weathered this crisis just like we've weathered a lot of other crises. I don't know whether anyone is thinking in terms of really sitting down and saying, okay, in the next 1 year, how do we get 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 megawatts of power up and running?
Now, there's always an interesting undercurrent of politics, in any crisis. And here we've seen that the centre is blaming UP for having over-withdrawn. Also, interestingly, just before the power crisis was actually resolved, Sushil Kumar Shinde was promoted to being the Home Minister. Now, how do you view this sort of political play in the mid of such a crisis?
Well, everything is linked to politics, right? And the fact is, UP is run by a government which is at times friendly with the central government, and on whom the central government depends a lot. But I don't think it's really a political issue, right? I don't think any one state is more irresponsible than any other state in this country. I think all states are equally irresponsible. I think the central government is also equally irresponsible. So I don't think you can get into an argument and say state A is very responsible and state B is irresponsible. I don't think it works that way. As far as the cabinet shuffle was concerned, I think it was pre-planned. It was just bad timing, right? I think it would have made sense to wait for some time till the dust had settled down over the grid collapse. But that said, Parliament opens next week, so they did have a limited window. It goes on till the middle of next week. They could have done it sometime next week, but it's fine.